Hi, this video clip we're going to be doing both sections 3 and 4 of chapter 24. So section 3 starts the Silk Road. In the previous video we talked about the Eastern Silk Road, and now this one we're going to pick up where we left off with the Western Silk Road. So the Western Silk Road started in Kashgar, which is over here, where the east route ended. And here people would change their forms of transportation. So going east, this part, you were traveling through the desert. So you're going to travel with a camel. Camels were better in the desert because if you think of if you've ever been to the zoo or whatever, looked up close at a camel, they have like really big feet. They're wider, so when they walk in the sand, they like their weight is dispersed more, so they don't sink in, and they can walk in sand easier. It's just think of like wearing snowshoes in the snow, like those big tennis racket looking things. You can walk on top of the snow easier because your weight is dispersed amongst the surface area of the snowshoe versus if you were to stand on it in your with your regular everyday walking feet, your feet would go all the way down, and next thing you know, you're near thigh high up in snow. So the camel's head were built better to be in the desert. Um, they also had a second row of eyelashes. So again, when you had those sandstorms and stuff, camels were able to navigate and thrive in that environment better because their eyes were better protected. However, going west, the terrain was very different. You can see here, you have like the desert here that they're traveling around, but now you're having to walk through the Pamir Mountains and the Hindu Kush Mountains. So you're going to need a different kind of animal. So a lot of people used yaks. So you think that kind of an animal, they have hooves, and so they can take steps uh, on the smaller trails. They didn't take up as much room. But if you took a yak to the desert, those little tiny hooves are just going to sink down into the sand. It would make it very difficult for them to walk. You can see here, this is a picture of what some of the terrain looks like in that region of the world. So the western route started in Kashgar, which is the Pamir Mountains. While traveling through here, travelers often experience dizziness and headaches due to the lack of oxygen. So I think the higher you go up, the thinner the atmosphere is. The thinner the atmosphere is, the less oxygen supply you have. So they would get altitude sickness. That's like we know that that's what's going on today, and we've given that phenomena a name. And so you're not getting as much oxygen to your brain and to your body organs, and you can cause dizziness and failure of the body. So it was really dangerous, depending on how like high you had to go up and how long you had to stay up at that altitude. Mountain passages were narrow and very difficult to travel. Sometimes, if there was a passage that became so narrow, they would just ditch their animals and they would take the goods that they're trying to transport and they would hand walk them through a passage and then go back to get the rest of them if they needed. So it was a very, very difficult travel. So after they made it through the Pamir Mountains, they went through a very fertile valley, which is known today as Afghanistan. And then they would go over the Iranian Plateau. Um, and there were some important stops there along the way. And they would then stop in cities to prepare themselves to be able to then cross through the Syrian desert. So there are many different types of terrains that people had to navigate through. So when traveling the Silk Road in the Syrian desert, this was difficult because you had all these things that wanted to come at you. They had wolves and lions and snakes and vultures. Oh my! So when you had to keep your eye out for these things that wanted to hurt you. So you had, I'm sure, bandits that wanted to take your stuff and animals that wanted to eat you. Very exciting. Who wants to do that trip? Once on the other side of the Syrian desert, you reached the end of the Silk Road and the port city of Antioch. From there, goods would be placed on ships and then sent to places beyond on the Mediterranean Sea. So traders from Egypt, Arabia, and Persian, they sold some things that were unique to their areas. They sold perfumes and cosmetics. Remember how we talked about with Egypt, how they had their fancy makeup that they would wear and their perfumes. And the rugs from Arabia and Persia, you gotta love that those Persian rugs. So these things were very valuable coming from those regions. Central Asian items that were sold were metal, dyes. You would get that from different materials, and then unfortunately, they would have people that they would capture and sell as slaves. If you think about like the metal items, that makes sense that metal was a big thing because in that area of Asia, the continent of Asia, you have mountains, and so there's more of a likelihood to be able to have materials like places to mine in that region. So again, going with goods that were exchanged along the Western Silk Road. So some of the things that the Romans bought were glass products, trays, vases, and necklaces and small bottles. Asbestos made for making fireproof cloth. Yes, this is the same stuff that's in buildings today that they condemn buildings for. Like if you're renovating a building and they see it, you have to stop immediately because it can cause cancer if inhaled. Um, they got coral. The people in China wanted that because they thought it could cure illnesses. And then Romans, they loved silk so much that they used it for everything because, you know, they like to be fancy. And the Romans were buying so much of the silk that finally the Roman emperor was worried about the Roman Empire running out of gold, like their gold supplies being diminished and sent all over to China. So he told people that it made them look like wimps, like they didn't look as tough and manly wearing all that silk. So even though that wasn't the case, he was just worried about Rome losing their gold. So this starts section 4, cultural exchanges and the Silk Road. So we talked about a lot of like goods, things that are tangible that you can trade on the Silk Road. But another thing that was mentioned briefly before was this idea of cultural diffusion, thoughts and ideas. And I put these pictures up because I knew you would recognize them all from our previous Buddhism chapter. And just to remind you of the example of the cultural diffusion activity that we did, how Buddhism spread, and it spread on this very Silk Road. So you can see how different areas inspired and changed this idea, but this idea still spread throughout Asia and the Mediterranean. So some examples of cultural diffusion. The Chinese learned how to make blown glass like the Romans were making. The spread of beliefs like Buddhism, which became a major religion in China. People's diets changed because new foods and plants to garden had been shared. People would take plants or seeds with them along the way. And people could start gardening like cultivating these new products. Chinese, they imported grapes, cucumbers,